you have no problem with the ping signifying time rather than a clap?
What's that?
Is you okay with the ping signifying?
Yeah.
I'm not complaining.
Alright, so congratulations to all the teams in making it to the semi-finals. And I guess without further ado, if we have streaming ready, give the floor to the Prime Minister.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I guess it's a topic that we all like to discuss today about if we support Athletic Bilbao Cantera's policy, and we stand firmly convinced that this is a policy that should be go on and should be expanded to other teams and other territories of Spain and in general in the world. But before I'm going to analyze you how this is gonna profit and benefit, how this policy benefits the athletes and the Athletic Bilbao in general as a sport club and the sports facilities and the sports in Vasquez, and Vasil is going to talk to you about the benefits and the profit in general in the society. Let me define the topic we have in front of us today. Although it's pretty obvious, we all know what Athletic Bilbao is, a professional sports club, and Cantera policy. And Cantera policy is a policy that we all heard. We all with this specific club only signs players that either had Vasquez, that come from the Vasquez country, either they have lived in for a amount of years. So what I'm gonna talk to you today about is how this measures benefits sports. But before doing so, let me tell you what's going on in Europe these days. UEFA is planning and tries to propose financial fair play. What financial fair play is? That all sports should spend less or the same amount as they profit from. So this financial fair play is going to the direction that all teams should be self-dependent and not be dependent from someone that's outside giving money from subsidies or stuff like that. So we had this general direction in Europe first. And second, we have the other direction from UEFA, again from football, that says that all sports teams that participate in European Cups and European Championship should have some players from their country and some players from the country first, and some players that they have have been evolved through the club itself. So why this Athletic Bilbao Cantera policy is even better than that, even better than what UEFA proposed. Athletic Bilbao only signs players that are through their own facilities, or they are through facilities, or the facilities first, or they have the same mentality as the other players. And this thing has been provided with Athletic Bilbao the 4th place in this year Premier Division. What does this show us? That shows us that this policy and this idea is something that can be good and can create benefit in the athletic part of this team, of this part. So what do they have? They have only players that play from the beginning in this team, since they are 6-7 years old, till they reach the first team of the club. So they learn to play in the specific way, in the specific manner, and then they are being told and taught how to play and in a specific way of thinking in football and in general in life. So we have in a moment. So we have a specific way of teaching people and teaching the athletes themselves how to play in this specific club. Tell me.
Why can't an Italian buy into this philosophy of football and being trained in the ways that might be to the benefit? Why can't an Italian buy into the philosophy of this football club and the way that they go about playing the game?
Okay, thank you. If he's been if he's from 6-year-old in this territory or he's being taught like this, then Athletic Bilbao will consider him as a player of their ideology, and then he can be also a part of the Athletic Bilbao cantera policy. The policy says that if you are being brought up in this specific territory, then yes, you are eligible of playing. Then, how this also profits the team itself. We have, for example, the Real Madrid or Manchester City that spent a lot of money, a lot of funds in order to buy the best players in the region, and then they sell these players. And we have on the contrary, we have Athletic Bilbao that evolves these players or use them in order to be better and to be in a professional level, in a top professional level, or sell these players in their top quality. So what this shows to us that we have a club that first of all has the financial fair play, so it within the ideas of UEFA. Second, has its own players involved. It has involved its own players and can gain profit from that. And also, what we do have from this is that this team has a sustainability and can work through the years, because they don't buy, they don't depend on their money, but they depend on their technique of how to teach students to teach sports. How to teach the players, and then how this helps the club in an amateur level. All people that come from Basque country, they know that they have a chance, if they are good enough, they have a chance of being in the team. They have a chance to be evolved, to try to be in the team. And it's better because if in the contrary you have a player in Madrid and wants to be in Real Madrid, he has not only the other players from Madrid to go against him, but he has all the other players of the world to go for his position. But we have in Basque country children that are more determined in order to go for this and to go and hunt their dream, and it's easier for them to get for their dream. And also we have the amateur athletics from all the states to go and promote the amateur sport, the amateur athleticism in this territory, because we have these students wanting to be in this philosophy, in this idea of Athletic Bilbao. So what I have told you today, I have told you that this policy helps. It's in the ideology of what we need from modern football and for modern sport in general, and how this policy is something that is it's safe and goes on the safe way by the meaning that it's not depending from the money, but helps and the territory and the sports and the players to be better than the money. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In opening the case for side opposition, I want to look at three things. First, I want to talk about why we think the cantera policy is inherently self-defeating in terms of how Bilbao as a football club aims to function as a football club. Secondly, I want to look at why cantera actually is inherently divisive as a policy and the harms that we derive from that. And thirdly, this idea of why through this divisiveness we actually get discrimination, and why this is inherently in breach, or certainly flies in the face of, free movement of persons principles and free movement of labour principles that the trend suggests that Europe has tried to move towards in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. But firstly, I'm going to indulge in a little bit of rebuttal. So, like the last speaker, the Prime Minister's speech kind of focused mainly around the justification of things like UEFA's financial fair play regulations and things like UEFA stipulations on home-owned players. Right. Firstly, like UEFA financial fair play, we see inside opposition that like these can still operate for better or worse without cantera. Like we think that UEFA can introduce particular like regulations to regulate the amount of money that is spent without a specifically like ethnically nationalist policy implemented by football clubs. clubs. So we don't think that stands. What Cantera actually does in relation to financial fair play, if financial fair play is successful and like sort of deflates the prices that football clubs tend to pay for players and wages and so on, like what we actually think is that no thank you, Atletico Madrid clubs adopt a Cantera-like policy will be still unable to bid for these cheaper players when financial fair play is successful. So we don't really think that that's relevant, and nor do we think that the analysis that he gave us applies. And then we look at this idea of UEFA stipulations on the amount of homegrown players that you have to register as part of a squad, right? Firstly, Cantera undermines this anyway when it mandates that like French players from the Basque region can be part of your match squad. We think that's like inherently like counterintuitive. And secondly, like we don't necessarily think that the policy UEFA, no thank you, implements should be as aggressive as this, right? We don't think that mandating that 3 players from a particular country sitting on your bench is as aggressive as your entire 21-man squad or 21-woman squad has to be from a particular country. We think on side opposition you can achieve all of the aims that UEFA are trying to achieve without a specifically aggressive policy such as Cantera. So we don't necessarily think that any of that stands. Firstly, let's look at the idea of self-defeating, the why Cantera self-defeating. Let's look at football clubs. We think they're inherently selfish actors, right? Like they want to make progress in their respective leagues, they want to make progress in cup competitions and in European competitions if they reach that, right? Like we fundamentally, like Cantera means that they have no ability to access in the main the transfer market, the football transfer market. Like there are two windows that clubs can operate in to sign players, but we don't necessarily think that they're able to utilise opportunities that might arise in those transfer windows in order to sign players either on a free or for consideration at the point at which they're limited to signing players from their youth farms, from their youth academies. We think it's extremely harmful. Let's look at Cantera specifically and what it intends to achieve. Cantera is aimed at promoting Basque nationalism, right? It's aimed at exporting the idea that Basqueness is a separate sort of identity, a cultural identity that people can self-identify and derive from, right? Realistically, on side opposition, what we say is the best way of doing that is actually for these clubs to get into Europe, right? So like let's look at like a club like Barcelona. At the point at which Barcelona signs Lionel Messi from Argentina, like we don't necessarily think that's undermined Barcelona's ability to identify as a civic like a Catalonian club. They're still able to like generate this atmosphere of being a culturally Catalonian club while signing players from France, signing players from Argentina and so on. We think the best way for a club like Atletico Bilbao to export their identity as a Basque club, as a Basque like entity, is to sign players from other countries to raise themselves up the leagues, to get into things like the Champions League, to get into things like the Europa League, because they're more likely through the exposure that those competitions bring to clubs to export that no thank you, right? You're more likely for a club like Atletico Bilbao or any other club that has this particular like nationalism that it wants to promote, they're more likely to be able to bring that to the world when they're able to gain access to the exposure that these European competitions brings. Why can they not get that at the moment, right? We say that, yeah, sure, Bilbao may have finished 4th this season, they may have been in the Champions League 2 years ago. We don't think this happens regularly enough for them to be able to bring this Basque product to the world. We think inside opposition, the best way to bring to the world your identity and your cultural like ownership and self-worth is to do away with Cantera so that you can access the exposure that major institutions like the Champions League bring. Let's look at division, no thank you, and why we think this is harmful. We think ultimately Cantera brings about something of a destabilisation of the territorial integrity and the power influence that Spain can bring in terms of its interactions with other countries in the international community. Why is this? Like, we think the Basque situation is extremely porous. Like, you have the France-Spain side of things. The point at which a football club creates a situation where Basqueness is mutually exclusive, right? Like, at the point at which, like, the club like Atletico Madrid signs a player from the French side of things, like normal like Spaniards out with the Basque region, right, look at this and essentially say, well, this is undermining our own identity as a Spaniard because they're essentially like dividing themselves away from us as Basques and so on, right? We think this is extremely harmful. There's tensions created between like Spaniards who are not part of the Basque region. I'll take you in a minute, right? And at the point at which that happens, Spaniards resent this cultural identity. You're more likely to have cultural divisions and the harms that follow from that when you have this, and we think then that leads onto a harm in terms of Spain's ability to project itself as a stable nation on the international stage. If there's a point, I'll take it.
Sure, but we already see that the Basque country has a very fractured sense of social identity, of social cohesion. So there is a policy that reinforces that you are indeed a community, you do indeed have an individual identity, just to get that homegrown identity that Barcelona already has. Why would you reject that?
Right, so we say that actually clubs like Barcelona and clubs like, for example, like clubs who self-identify with a particular culture are able to cultivate that without a specifically aggressive ethnically nationalist policy. I've answered this point. At the point at which Barcelona can go off and sign Lionel Messi and still cultivate itself as a Catalan club with espousing particular ideals against the Spanish state, we think that's a more effective way of achieving their aims. Like that point just doesn't stand. But let's look at discrimination finally and why free movement of persons and labour principles are compromised, right? Like we see a trend in Europe, particularly with the European Union over the last sort of 20 to 30 years, certainly a move towards free movement of labour, the ability for like not necessarily just football players, but specifically to this motion football players to move around as they see fit and take employment. Like what we see, like an example, this would be Jean-Marc Bosman at the point at which he wanted to move from another club for free, and they said you can only play for a certain amount of clubs at a specific time or whatever. Like we see Bosman as an example of this. We see again cantera harms this, at the point at which it creates this like sense of divisiveness, at the point at which I cannot as a football player sign for a club like Athletico Bilbao because I'm excluded due to being a Scot and I'm not Basque. I think it's extremely harmful in that sense. We think that when you start to use subnational units of ethnicity, and let's note we think that this is ethnic nationalism and not necessarily a more civic nationalism that we see with a club like Barcelona. We think when you start to use subnational units of ethnicity for employment purposes is extremely harmful. We think it cuts you off as a football club, not only from sources of talent that you can sign to boost your own image in terms of your own civic nationalism that you might want to promote, but we also think this fundamentally undermines the tenets of European free movement of persons labour. Like fundamentally, we think this is self-defeating for our football club's aims and purposes, right? But not only that, we think it brings much more broader, like pernicious harms in terms of culture and identity, in terms of how I'm blocked off based on where I've come from or where I've resided for a certain amount of time. We inherently reject this proposal and we urge you to oppose.
Thank you, previous speaker. We give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most honourable judges, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before I start off with my constructive case and my rebuttal, I'd like to state I know nothing about sports, but I'm going to give it a shot. Anyway, so starting off with the rebuttal from what we heard from the gentleman from side of opposition, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, he told us that, well, you know, if you're friends, if you're from the France side of the Basque country, you cannot sign. That's simply not true. You can. But anyway, moving on to his actual arguments. He told us, first of all, that this policy is self-defeating, that Bilbao doesn't do very well because it has this policy. This is clearly not true, ladies and gentlemen. Bilbao is in the Champions League this year. It's doing fairly well for a team, as a football team. I mean, and he told us, okay, maybe it is this year, but it won't be next year, or it wasn't every year. Well, we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, that they cannot by any means prove that their cantera policy is the reason for that. There's many teams that never ever go into the Champions League, that don't do really well in European championships, etc., and they don't have the cantera policy. We don't see what's the connection between the cantera policy and not being the best team in the world every year, right? So we think it's proven that it can do pretty well with the cantera policy. We don't think it impedes its ability to compete in the competitions. The next thing that he was talking about was this Basque identity and how this causes divisions, no thank you, and instability. We're saying, ladies and gentlemen, the thing that causes instability is the lack of a sense of community. We're saying that cantera policy reinforces the sense of community for the Basque people, and that definitely helps with stability in the area in many ways. And the final thing we heard from the side of opposition was that this is basically discrimination, that not allowing people from Scotland to sign up in Athletico Bilbao is discrimination. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a football club. Employment is at will, right? You can basically say, I like you, I'll take you. I don't like you, I won't take you. You don't have to justify why to anybody. So it's not any more discrimination than asking if you have a company in Scotland, asking for the person you are employing to speak English, right? It makes sense. Whatever. It's not discrimination to be able to choose who you want to sign in your team. We don't see a really big problem with that. But moving on to my constructive case, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to talk to you about today is how it basically benefits in terms of society, the region in general. So the first thing that we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that we believe athleticism and not just professional sports are really important for a region, for a country, and especially for the young people of that country. We're saying that the cantera policy that Athletico Bilbao is using really helps in that respect. Why? Because of all the things that Harry explained to you before. That creates a need for that team to heavily invest in youth academies in terms of football, just a second, because it needs to be able to find really good players that come from this area. Yeah, go.
Celtic Football Club quite proudly says that it's from an Irish background, but doesn't limit itself to Irish Catholic players. Why can't a football club invest all of this money in youth academies that you talk about and sign players from other countries?
It can, but it doesn't. In reality, it doesn't happen. When you have the very easy option of just having someone pay a few million euros and buying the best player there is without having to do any work for it, then many teams unfortunately take that road. What we're saying is that the cantera policy forces, in a way, it forces this team to invest. It's not a matter of preference, as in the case you're referring to, but it's a matter of urgency for them, basically. They need it. If they don't do it, then they will not be able to survive in the league. And we're saying that's a good thing. Having an incentive to invest on young people, on sports for young people, so that people in the area have access to good sporting facilities and all that. We're saying that's definitely a good thing that the cantera policy creates in the region, and we'd like to see more of that in Europe. We're not saying we'll force everybody to do it. We're just saying it's a good idea, we like it, we'd like to see more of it, right? That's all we're saying. The next thing I want to talk to you about, ladies and gentlemen, is the fans, right? And how basically this policy creates a fan base for that team, and why that's a good thing for the region. You have very good teams, very big teams like Manchester United and stuff. They have obviously a large base because they're a large team, but the Bilbao's fan base is disproportionately large, we think, compared to how it's doing. And that is exactly because of the cantera policy. We're saying that fans in the region support this team because they feel it's a part of their home place. It's a part of who they are. It's not just some big company with lots of money that buys players, then sells them off, and kind of operates like an import-export company for players by buying at some price and trying to sell more expensively, right? We're saying the fans there feel that Bilbao is part of the Basque country. And why is that good? Because they support their team, they go more often to watch games. That means there's there's financial gains for the team and for the region, obviously. And we're saying, just a second, and we're saying this inspires people to try out their dreams, to try and become and play football.
Okay, right, so you keep talking about youth academies. What if a young person that lives just out with the Basque region wants to benefit from Atlethic Bilbao's training facilities and is denied that opportunity because they're not from the Basque region? How is that helping the youth?
Right, okay, so there's one marginal case for a guy that lives across the street from the Basque region and he can't get in. Tough. I mean, okay, no policy is perfect. We're saying as an idea, as a logic, it's good. It forces teams to work in that respect, and that's good. It's not perfect. Okay, some people will be left out. The other thing I want to talk to you about, ladies and gentlemen, is corruption in football, right? Because Bilbao's cantera policy kind of combats corruption. Why is that? We've seen the opposition talked a lot about Barcelona and the transfer policy that they have and all that. We're saying in Barcelona, we've seen that the previous president was convicted because he used the transfer policy of the team for corrupt purposes, ladies and gentlemen. There's lots of money involved in buying and selling players, and it's a very good way for people to launder money. It happens all over Europe, all over the world. They use this transfer policy for corrupt purposes. We're saying Bilbao's policy severely limits their ability to do that, and we've seen that. There's never been any reported corruption for Bilbao, and the reason is cantera policy is because they don't have the option of going and buying the most expensive transfer player there is around, so there's not so much money being involved. Right, so what have I told you today? Harry told you it's good for sports. I've told you it's good for the region in terms of supporting the young people. I've told you it's good because of the fan base, and I've told you it's good because it limits the ability for corruption. So for all these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thank you, previous speaker. Call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Leader of the Government said that Bilbao did well considering it was a provincial club. It's precisely that psyche that you are somehow out of the bubble, that you are unable to hold your own, that causes them to define themselves in internalistic terms. It causes them not to look at achievement in absolute terms, and it is ultimately the reason why their definition of success is lower than their competitors. When Barcelona considers success, they consider it to be winning the league year in, year out, winning the Champions League most years. Compare this to Athletic Bilbao. In their cause of self-restraint, they occasionally qualify for the Champions League, but they haven't won the league for over 30 years, Mr. Speaker. That probably is going to be in part a result of them limiting the pool of talent from which they are able to draw. I'm going to develop specifically in my substantive on the nature of coextensive identity and how ultimately this serves to undermine it, and also how multiculturalism is better facilitated if you don't do that. But I'm also going to basically deconstruct quite a lot of what you heard from the government. Sit down for the moment. But we were told that it fosters a sense of community. We weren't told first and foremost why developing a sense of community is inherently good. We probably think that there are reasons why it might be good, but the basis of that community probably could then be contested. They didn't explain to us why this is the only way to foster that form of community. They don't explain how there are not other less harmful alternatives that can avoid all of the harms that they are ultimately incurring. They say that employment is at will, Mr. Speaker. Employment is not at will at the point that a particular group is systemically excluded from the employment market. When Rangers say that they said in the 1980s and before that they wouldn't sign Catholics, that systemically limited the opportunities of Catholics to be able to achieve things. Observe, Mr. Speaker, that they didn't, Mr. Speaker, that they didn't note the difference that I pointed out in the point of information about why an Italian can't inherently buy into the community ideal of say, a Castile club or whatever. The notion that simply because they don't have, maybe they don't have the language, okay, but well, fine, maybe issue a language requirement for participating in a particular club. Don't issue some sort of kind of ethnic origin requirement. What we see is that even as far as to say, oh, you can be naturalised, the point is you still have to make an undertaking to live in the Basque Country for a number of years. That probably then limits your employment opportunities. That probably limits your ability to be able to integrate into this identity in the first place. That's probably harmful at the point where that identity then doesn't have any new kind of influx of ideas about alternative ways of doing things and kind of gradually developing itself into something more sophisticated and something more inclusive. But also, like, we recognise that there can be things like genuinely determining occupational requirements with reference to employment. We see that these sort of restrictions can be put in place where it's necessary actively to be able to engage with people and to be able to achieve the objectives of your employment. We don't think that simply being an Italian means that you cannot fulfil your objectives in employment as a footballer, or that you can't embrace a particular football style or culture. We see that many attitudes in terms of football can actually transcend nationalities. One of the strongest things about it. If you look at likes of tiki-taka with reference to Barcelona, you see it's a culture about the universalisation of football. The same was true of the approach that Cruyff took with respect to the Dutch game in terms of kind of one-touch football. We saw that these ideas can actually transcend cultural identity, and we think that that's therefore ultimately something doesn't stand. But then we get the notion that it's somehow urgent because the fans feel a disproportionate sense of identity. Tell me now, seriously, how the people in Barcelona don't somehow feel as though they belong to Catalonia simply because they sign Lionel Messi. Go. Closing.
Alright, so for football group, it's not just simply that they want to win the Champions League or they want to achieve profits. They're also for community building, and that's if they support the community and giving down and back again for the community, from the community to the club, and from the club to the community.
But here's the point, right? You don't have to have been born in or spent several years growing up in the Basque Country to be able to contribute to that community. If anything, getting a high-profile person from another country who is a world-renowned footballer is more likely to attract interest into that community. You're more likely to get things like commercial sponsorship attaching to the club, which is able to improve them. Observe particularly in the Spanish league, Mr. Speaker, that the way that TV rights are by club, not by group. Now, by the group of the league as a whole. Now, what does this mean? This means that they're actually self-limiting the kind of natural pool of people that would be interested in providing financial support to that club. You're more likely to be able to build youth facilities if you get some sort of inward investment from the outside. Simply trying to recycle money from within, that's probably not going to be relatively helpful. So that's going to undermine your ability then to bring through young talent. But moreover, let's deal with this idea of coextensive identity, because this is something they ultimately fail to understand. We didn't say that, that French Basques can't play. The whole point is they can play, but it undermines the sense in which Basqueness and Spanishness can coexist, and they can form some form of compound identity. The idea that somehow Basques need to be necessarily mutually exclusive actually tends this identity, if not towards kind of overt ethnic nationalism, then at least towards some sort of quasi-ethnic nationalism, because it's defining itself not in terms of kind of state identity, of civic identity, of what it is that you contribute to your area, but simply the nature of your origins or where you happen to be. These are accidents, Mr. Speaker. These are not things you consciously choose. the value that is placed on you by a society is not based on things that you actively choose, we think that is something that is ultimately unfair. That is something that obviously serves to undermine your sense of self and your ability to feel as though you can belong to that community. This is particularly important in the context of movements which also have things like secessionist movements. It's not necessarily that the existence of this policy kind of fuels kind of Basque fervour for separation, but what it does do is it creates a sense of differentness. It creates a sense in which you cannot meaningfully be Spanish if you be some sort of broader idea of Spanishness unless you buy into this ideal of what it means to be Basque. That then undermines your ability to be able to bring through broader kind of compound identities, and it means that somehow the ability to go away and do something ambitious somewhere else is undermined. Even insofar as you may have particular pride for the place that you're born in, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be actively dissuaded by a system from going to other places, by essentially lessening the competition, but making it easier for you to get a job playing for Bilbao rather than somewhere else. We think that ultimately causes people to be insular about what it means to be a football player. We think the idea that you can go and embrace a new culture and develop the game and actually develop a sense of identity, this is the Italian point. When someone can come in with a fresh perspective, understand the insular aspects of what people take for granted as conventional wisdom within a community, and say, hold on, maybe that's not right, maybe we should change this. Sometimes that will cause friction, but the way that you develop a sense of community is precisely by acknowledging that friction exists and try to actually resolve it productively and actually try to make accommodations. So for those reasons, Mr. Speaker, because it doesn't benefit Atlethic Bilbao, because it wouldn't benefit anyone who adopted it, and because it ultimately creates more divided societies, I strongly beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We call the next member of government.
Mr. Speaker, in my speech today, I'm going to talk about a process. I'm going to talk about how a locally sustainable and locally cultivated football club can actually contribute to the social cohesion of an area that's been fractured for centuries. And then I'm going to show you how that social cohesion, especially in Basque Country, is incredibly important to foster some sort of dialogue, to instill good values in that region, and how football intrinsically can help that process out by cultivating local talent and by feeding back into the community that fostered its creation, right? So I'm going to talk about football as a social and a communal business, right? I'm going to talk about how that feeds into Basque identity and community via sport, right? And I also want to talk a bit about how we believe that most of the points about aggressive nationalism on the opposition bench don't stand, right? So let's get something clear. Atlethic Bilbao's policy is not ethnically nationalist. It's not ethnically restricted. It was particularly pointed out in the Infomanos that it's regional, right? It's not based on ethnicity. If you grew up in the Basque area, whether you're a Spaniard or a Basque person or whoever else lives there, right, you get to participate. And we believe that's incredibly important because it does indeed transcend those harmful effects that they keep reiterating, right? It does indeed transcend those effects that we usually associate with ethnically nationalist organizations and activities, maybe later, right? So we think that that's sort of done, right? And there, on the topic of discrimination, well, we don't think it's that much better if, like a football club owned by a market-oriented, owner or something, or a corporation actually exploits sort of particular different types of discrimination, such as, exploiting, kids from Ghana and Togo and basically recruiting there and, barring those kids from actually attending school or something and pushing them into, competitive sports. So we do believe there are other more harmful tendencies in nationalistic ways in football already. But let me talk about this whole idea of the home team advantage and why it's good to have this kind of local sustainability building up from the grassroots. So understand that in the context of football, what we see quite often is that once a football club actually approaches the kinds of attitudes that they're talking about, where they sort of pick and choose from the best players all over and make the home city proud, it doesn't work. Because what the home city sees is that the team is neglecting its own youth. The team is neglecting the people it could cultivate, neglecting the talent back home, the people who actually started the club and made it possible to be successful in the first place, right? And we see this with Manchester City, we see this with Chelsea, where moneyed interests and moneyed owners actually do come in and do exploit the club's name and fame and all that, and do indeed bring in foreign talent, which the locals do in fact honor by not going to matches, by not being ardent fans, by not being as vigorously, obligated to that club as, you see in, for instance, in Bilbao, in Atletico Bilbao's case, right? So you do see this effect of feeding back into the community, making the local sports team basically just more sustainable, more locally sustainable, and seeing, how this builds into like a community building effect, right? And we see that there's also a separate point to this, right? We do believe that Atletico Bilbao, especially in a region where it's fractured into like 2 or 3 different countries, where there's a bunch of national, different identities within Basque country and within Basques themselves, right? Where there's Spaniards and Basques and Aragonians living side by side. We do see that this football club is accountable first to the locals and first to its home base, and secondly to ideals of transnational identities and market mechanisms, right? We think that they're accountable first to that, to their locals, not because it's some nice idea of local democracy, whatever, but because it makes the club sustainable. It gives them an invigorated fan base and home base, and they can build on that, right? And so we believe that these mechanisms generally, where you actually, reinvest in local talent, you reinvest in the community, they build up social cohesion. They do, in fact, build up communities that wouldn't exist in the first place. And especially in a region such as Basque Country, that has seen so much fracturing of these communities and of these, communal relationships over the past 30 to 40 years, we do see that channeling these tensions via social cohesion achieved through sports and competitive sports, and being accountable to your home base before you're accountable to UEFA or whatever, we see that that's actually tremendously important for those kinds of communities. Go.
Okay, River Plate, Santos, Barcelona, all clubs that are able to build up a massive fan base that ascribe to a greater community goal. You please be the first person from Brockbench to tell me why a cantera-like policy is so necessary in these cases. Okay, so talking about Barcelona, we do indeed see backlashes when Barcelona brings in players from other countries. We do indeed see backlashes for all kinds of sports teams when they're perceived as neglecting their home fans, right? And especially in situations such as Basque Country, especially in situations where there is a fractured identity, we think that if you can actually foster that identity, and no, it doesn't have to be aggressively ethno-nationalistic, you do indeed achieve things such as a local fan base building up around that idea, right? And we do think it channels, the energies of youth and the tensions that exist in youth there because of their lack of identity, because you have a Spanish passport, but at the same time you identify as a Basque, as an Aragonian living in Basque Country, right? We do see that those problems can be channeled into various communal activities, such as being, rooting for the home team because you know that they're your people, they're amongst your, creed, etc. And we think that that actually can be beneficial in a situation where nationalistic tendencies don't really actually have a room to flourish, right? No, thank you. Right. So how does social cohesion actually play into channeling tensions away and making it a better place for Basque people to live, and making this how does Atletico Bilbao build into Basque Country, right? Well, we see that there's especially a big problem there of lingering tensions. You don't necessarily see these usually, and we do have separate kinds of experiences throughout Europe of how lingering social tensions actually can come to the surface in really violent ways. And we do believe that the history of the ERA and the history of Basque Country and the history of the extremism there and the civil war-esque situations, we do believe that those situations prove to us that indeed in regions with that kind of fractured identity and all those ethnic tensions, if you have something to build upon and something to build around, and if you actually can foster that community to organically build up from the bottom up, you do indeed represent something more important than perhaps you would represent in Barcelona or Manchester, etc., because you do indeed achieve a social role. You do, you step out of the stadium, you actually achieve something for the community around you. The community feels that effort, they feel that energy being channeled into their, indirect interest, and they therefore become more ardent supporters of the club. And fundamentally, we believe that actually does channel tensions into more, community building, into cultivating local talent. And just to touch on this last point, we do believe that this is very accommodating. We do believe that when you, employ ideals like fair play, you actually do contribute to rule of law being more respected. When you play into ideals of an equal playing field, you do indeed sort of foster more
agreement and more dialogue between different, creeds and colors, right? And we do believe that this way, at least, Basque Country does have an identity that it can cling to. It's probably not the same kind of tensions aren't going to come up in like separatist movements, etc., because they know that they can be an identity without having the weird national borders around them. And so we believe that because it channels tensions, because it builds up community, and because it retains local talent, this policy is actually really beneficial. I beg you to propose.
Member of Government and the co-member of Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk about two things that have already been largely touched upon this debate, but from slightly different perspectives, namely those two things being identity discrimination and then the benefits that actually come to the club itself if we don't have this horrible discriminatory policy that we don't like very much. Okay, but firstly, a bit of rebuttal. I think it's 4 points. Yeah. So they tell us that the first thing more or less that comes from the last speaker is that it's not really ethnic, so that makes it fine. The thing is that we don't see how being born into a certain region is any way less arbitrary or divisive for people than being of a certain ethnic minority or an ethnic background. Secondly, they tell us there's more harmful things, so that's fine. We think that's absolute bullshit. We shouldn't allow things to happen just because there's something worse out there. Third, they tell us we're going to be neglecting the local communities. Okay, quite a few points on this. First of all, we think if you have a larger pool of players, potential players, you could potentially raise both the competition and the quality of the players and their success, actually. All those things actually bring back more for the community, including more international exposure, including also profits and all those lovely things. Secondly, we think that two players from some other place, from some other region, doesn't necessarily undermine the fact that this still is a local club and it's seen as that. Thirdly, we're not standing here to say it should be absolutely international and it should have no Basque representation. We still think that the majority of it is still going to be Basque, but the thing is that we will not have it as a policy that we're not going to include anyone else, right? So that's okay. And generally, we think that there's going to be more competition, which actually does, and more success, both of which actually provide huge incentives for the youth to go towards actually wanting to be in that club and train for those things. So that's good as well. Then they talk about social cohesion, right? And they say, well, it builds up social cohesion to have one thing that you really like. Yes, if you're Basque, it's a really nice thing to have your social cohesion within that region. The problem is that there's issues there that are not just internal for the Basque region, but rather for like all the divided different identities that are in that space altogether, right? No, thank you. And the problem is going to be bigger when you actually push others away. Like the thing is, if you compare the level of exclusion, like when you exclude everyone else versus when you just allow a few people to actually come in, the exclusion is higher on their side of the house necessarily. So we think that's a bad thing. It's also a bad narrative to promote in general. Okay, so identity and discrimination. We think that sharing cultural enjoyment and being a fan of something, those are things that give you a sense of belonging and give you a sense of identity very often, and that's good, right? But what we're saying is that that sense of identity can be expanded to more things. It doesn't have to be separately this one region. It doesn't have to be exclusive to that. That identity can also be multiple things that are not mutually exclusive at once. And what we furthermore say is that it's simply not threatening to the Basque identity to include a few people in there, and that it actually provides for a more positive identity building. I'm going to go to that a bit later. Okay, so benefits. We think that if you're excluded from somewhere on the basis of something completely arbitrary, that affects your self-perception. You don't feel good enough because of something that isn't your fault. We think that those players who happen to be just born outside of the border that they arbitrarily drew, probably don't feel very good about themselves and don't feel like they have the same opportunities. Those things are things that create bad self-perception and resentment. We don't like any of that. And it is discriminating. Like, we don't allow companies to have discriminatory hiring policies based on ethnic background or where you're born in. But somehow when it's a football club, that's fine, right? We think it's generally can create in many people's eyes a very bad perception of the club itself. No, thank you. And that's also not something that is beneficial for them. No, thank you. We think that being born somewhere as is not the definitive of your value system, your mentality, all those really nice things. You can still have the same values that the Basque club or region has without actually being from that region yourself. And we think that if you want to promote the internal culture that they were talking about, you can still have those things. The thing is, however, that very often you can benefit from not having this one single identity there, from having the sharing of experiences among people and sharing different techniques of training and all those lovely things as well. And generally when you have people thinking the same way with the same value systems, that tends to lead to more extremist narratives and more nationalist narratives. That's why we think that this, they just say, oh, it doesn't have to be extremely nationalist. But generally that's what it veers towards when everyone is perpetuating the same ideas again and again in a circle. So furthermore, we think it makes it possible both internally and externally to push this negative type of nationalism for coaches, whatever, as a motivational thing, as also a solidarity thing for the fans. We don't think that's positive. I will take second.
Oh, yeah. So, Madam, I do understand your concern that nationalism generally reinforces itself in harmful ways, but we're talking about a region that's extremely multi-ethnic, that has never had the opportunity to have some sort of cohesive identity attributed to them. So why not get them this one chance to actually do form that cohesion and see if it succeeds?
A more inclusive identity would be more cohesive. That's the thing. If you exclude some parts of it, there's no cohesion, there's more divisiveness in that sense. Okay, so why do we think it's not threatening? Because sport is associated with enjoyment. People don't go there looking for, ways to annoy each other, whatever. Generally, people see this as something very nice, and we don't think that all the fans are just going to drop away because you have a few players from a different place. Okay, further on with the benefits of Bilbao in this case. Chances are they can actually increase their fan base in this case. That's one of the concerns they had on that side of the house. Because it's not really necessarily a threatening thing, and coexistence of multiple identities is not mutually exclusive necessarily, we think that more fans can actually try to appreciate the thing that they before didn't feel a part of, and now they can be. Those things are positive and can actually increase not only the pool of players or potential players, but also the pool of fans that can actually appreciate those things as well. We also think that there's very huge benefits in terms of experience sharing between different types of training. We think that sponsors no longer have this bad association with this discriminatory policy, and they're not only limited to this very specific region necessarily. We think that generally, if it's more merit-based and perceived as more fair, it's better for everyone, and it's more easier for them to be successful ultimately. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose. Yeah.
And call upon Garment Whip.
Right, thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. First of all, what we are neglecting here, that football clubs are not only for profits, not only for achieving things in major football leagues such as the Champions League or the National Championship. Football clubs are also for the community, for the fan base who are supporting for it, making the town, the city, where they are representing a stronger community. It has a role very strongly that this community who has that football club, and when that football club plays and win, we can't neglect the fact what is the atmosphere looks like. If there is a winning home game, if there is a winning city, I don't know, from in a city to revenging team playing, and one wins. Basically, they're the fan base there, the community who supports that, gonna be in such an enthusiastic state, which massively adds to that thing that this community simply gonna have stronger ties together among the fans, as also as that community gonna function better. We can't neglecting that, because as the fan basis is basically working as a family. So and if a community works as a family, if there are stronger ties among the individuals and also can define the community better itself, it's simply going to be stronger, better, because we live together. It's very important that we have something what binds us together, what we can stand for and we all support for. And that's why it's so important that we need to keep it in front of our eyes, that's how important football role is in building this community. No, definitely not. So, and then why is okay, why is this whatever progressive, so I don't know the name of this policy, but why being so progressive and standing on local player who are just like, let me emphasize this, because we are not talking about like, we are including all these people who has lived in the territory, so from that community, we are not excluding anyone, but what we are saying, you cannot buy anyone into the team who is not inside the region, but you doesn't need to be ethnically be Basque. It's fine if you have been socialized in the region, so you belong to that community, and that's important, and that's why it's not excluding anyone. Secondly, it's also a rebuttal for opening opposition. So when you say like, you know, with this policy, you make identities mutually exclusive, but it's not true, because Atlethic Bilbao, that stands for Bilbao, that's the team for that town, Bilbao. But these players still play in the Spain national team, and this is massively important, because that proves that you are both Spanish, and you are both a Bilbaoan citizen, or whatever, like, yeah, well, you get it. So, and then this is basically proves that just because being Basque, it also means, or a higher level, that you are Spain. So there you go, you get your mutual identity as a Spain and as a Basque, and as a Basque identity, it's definitely important to have a Basque community. Okay. No, thank you. Right, so I'm gonna have 3 points. So why, and I briefly talk about some of them already, but yeah, I'm going to be more into details. So why is it so important in the community? As I said, it's really, when you had in opening opposition this idea, you know, you should promote your Basqueness in Europe. You should go to the Champions League and say like, okay, that's the best, that's very important. We think you have more responsibility towards your fans, so towards these people who are locally come from. So it's not that you're promoting around, look, Atlethic Bilbao is a massively strong team from this team. It's not just the main goal. The main goal is you have more responsibility, that you're strengthening ties within Bilbao. That's why it's so important that you prioritize that local people, what you take into account first, and then the international environment. So no, thank you. Secondly, right, okay, then. So basically, why is football such a good mean to do this? Why is this the right platform, right? What was Aaron talking about, and what was one of our extension, that basically it channels away the tension. It's basically replaced. You can celebrate your basketball without violence. You go into the stadium and you cheer for all these people who are living together with you in that team. You can feel that you win. You can feel that this is an amazing Sunday because your team has won, and you are simply happier contributing to that society where you live in, and by that making it a healthier one. Shoot.
Creating a common sense of Basqueness doesn't create a unified community. It externalizes disunity within Spain. Why is Basque identity more important than Spanish identity or indeed global identity?
Alright, because in a town, you need to see yourself. Town also have a major, so there is also a town, local government, town as a community. So that's why we think in that region where Basques are, that it's completely okay. Well, actually, it's really good that they feeling together very well, among together. And as I was talking about, when you go national level, then you function in the national team as well. So there you go. Then when you go, you're Spain, Spanish. Sorry. So being Spanish as well. So, but when you are a team of a town, then it's completely fine to feel the Basqueness, and that's why it's so important. That's why we need to support it. And okay, so we had several ideas, like football clubs can function as like. Also, when you buy players into who are big names and not not a local guy, but they function better if you buy a big name, and by you will be better off as a football club. But what we say, and that's going to be my third point, it's not necessarily true, because like, first of all, we mentioned Barcelona. Barcelona is famous about that they use players in Barcelona team. There are players who come from very childhood. They are playing in Barcelona. So yes, they do have some Lionel Messi and people who are from Argentina and different countries, but still, Barcelona is very well loved in Catalonia and also worldwide, because they're not buying this just because we have a rich owner, then we buy these players who are the most famous one. So they support the idea of what this policy stands for, to that direction, that people like these football clubs who have a very good giving relationship to the community, and that the community gives back to the football club by their players. So that's why we think, and so if you look at it from the other way around, what was Aaron also mentioning, that these football clubs like Manchester City, when they got a new buyer and started to being less like Manchester City, so the team of not Manchester, but also buying players who were the most famous at that time. Basically, they didn't get any more this, like, you are the team of the Manchester. It's kind of lost by this force, and that it also supports the fact that also in global communities it's recognized. It's some football clubs are really nice, and this is important because the fan base is how this brand, what they think about these football clubs. You're gonna get your fans saying that's the brand, this is a nice, because they care about the community, they care about the locality, and by that you're also gonna get the financial support more from the fans, and that needs to for your club in order to maintain. So that's why we beg you to propose it.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll call upon the opposition whip.
So, dear Mr. Speaker, I am going to tell you about mainly how the identity influences this current situation of Bilbao and the fans around them and the people who would care about them, and also how it's discriminatory, and how these nationalist views become extremist and therefore leads to bad results. But for the beginning, a bit of rebuttal. We don't think that by having international players or whatever, it isn't depriving the enthusiastic state that the Basques could get from Bilbao's plays. We think that even the sense of belonging, like the place, is the most important. That it's Bilbao, it's a part of Basque country, so therefore they will believe in it. Therefore they will identify with it, and they will not so much care whether there is someone not Basque or isn't. The results and no, thank you. The results show up whether they will really identify, whether they will feel that enthusiastic feeling, and whether it will bring some good. And then the whip of government was saying that about Barcelona. We think that Barcelona example really brings for us that it shows that our idea is the right one, as there is the sense of community, although the players are international, and their success bring even more people together, and that they are on international level makes it possible to be more successful than Bilbao, than having just Basque people, because there are simply less of them.
On that point.
So yes, please.
can you explain to me? The policy says you can be from whatever, from Nigeria, but as long as you've lived here, we believe you've integrated into the Basque community, and we accept you. How does that lead to extremism and discrimination?
But that's a problem. I'm forced to be for a period of time in that city or whatever, in that region, to play there. It's like if I am a fan of Bilbao and the football player, and I'm really willing to play there, and I see that my thoughts are the same as theirs, but no, as I haven't been living there, now you are deprived from that chance and you will not get in there. So that's what we think is unright. So no, thank you. Now, about identity, we really find that this is discriminatory, that this birth lottery no, thank you. Well, still, like this club is deciding on basically on birth lottery whether and not on whether we having or not having the same values. We think that it's much more important that our identity comes from what is our perception of ourselves, not from the place where we have been living or not. And we don't allow, like, that's true that we don't allow for companies or whatever someone else to discriminate on basis of nationality, but when it comes to a club, it's really good to discriminate. We really don't understand how it could be so. No, thank you. Also, we think that this exclusion of other people who are not Basques is the wrongest thing, and that by sharing the identity and our thoughts, it's much more. It multiplies the benefit for the society around it, and it also shows for the Basques as such, who are divided among themselves, that they are able to be together or within themselves, within other nations, within a larger have larger sense of community, not only the one emphasizing the Basque community. It's important to be a community of sports. And now I would like to talk about role of sports as such. We think that sports are uniting people, uniting nations, and that by separating and by having this policy, it's like completely devastating that all the perception of sports. So it's not right at all. And when it comes to for example, also when it was mentioned about the freedom of movement, about national units, it's right that we have them, and it's the talent we can get from all over the world is more valuable than creating the talent only around ourselves and not taking it from all over the place. Yes, please.
Madam, but you yourself just told us that Basque country is massively divided. There's a national border drawn in right in the middle of it, right cutting through it. So why not make the exception in this case, perhaps, that locality does indeed foster good types of community building?
I already said that it's not only that having a larger community sense, it's not excluding having that community sense in between Basques. No, it's not. It's showing only more tolerance and more understanding of where they are, and that they are a national community, and that sport is something that can reunite all of them, not only just a few parts of Basque country. So therefore, as we are considering it's not fair, and as we are considering that this leads to more extremist values into the region as such, and that it deprives people to identify themselves with whatever they want to, we strongly beg you to oppose.
Thank you everybody for this debate, and run towards the pen.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, outside. We're officially done with the parliament, I think.
Yay!
Yeah.
So take all your stuff. Do you want to